that wonderful introduction. And the talk I'm going to give today will be an introduction as well to the rest of the seminar series. I'll touch on a number of topics that the future speakers in the series will go into in a lot more depth. So hopefully you can continue to come and continue to be part of this discussion. We also have the goal in this seminar series to really have a broad-based discussion that goes beyond what Deborah Tannen has called the argument culture and tries to actually build some shared understanding about these complex issues. Too often, these issues get cast in very black and white, yes or no terms, and I think that really gets in the way of having the kind of discussion and shared understanding that we want to build. So during the talk, instead of having questions directly from the audience after the talk, we will have some 3x5 cards that will be passed out, and maybe you can go ahead and pass those out now. And as you think of questions, just write them down and pass them in that direction. And our student coordinators here will collect those at intervals during the talk. They will then synthesize those questions and then ask the questions back to me and subsequent speakers in the series as we go. So that will give us an opportunity to see what the full range of questions from the audience is. They can prioritize them and put them in some sort of order and see if there's significant overlap, if there's very frequently asked questions, things like that. I should also, and then they will combine those with questions that have come from the several classes that we have attached to this seminar series. So this seminar series is the core for, I think, 6 different classes. And some of them are mentioned up here, and there's some announcements for those classes. So if you're in any of those classes, take a look at the board for announcements. One of the requirements in the classes is to read the speakers' papers before the talk and come up with some questions and post those on the web. And then those will also be assembled and presented to the speakers after their talk. This also gives us an opportunity. We'll also be videotaping the talks and summarizing the questions that come from the audience and posting those on the website. So you can go back and review them, or if you happen to miss one of the lectures, you can go to the website and look at the video, the PowerPoint presentation, and the question and answer session. And will give us an opportunity also to answer some of the questions that we may not have time for at the end of this period. We can answer those on the web, and you can go there and search and see if your question's been answered by the speaker. So I'm going to be the guinea pig for this process, and we'll see if we have any problems. We can work those out as we go. Okay, and I should mention that John Erickson, who's here somewhere, there he is co-organizing and co-teaching this series of classes with me. So if you have any hard questions, you should direct them in that direction over there. Any easy questions, I'll take down here. Okay, and John, keep track of time for me and don't let me go too far over. So let me just start by pointing out that actually solving problems in the real world requires that we integrate these 3 basic elements of having an adequate vision, both of how the world works and also of how we would like the world to be. Our paradigms, our scientific paradigms, are built on fundamental visions about how the world works. And this vision is changing and has been changing over time. And I think ecological economics is a change in the overall vision of how we see the way the world works. It also is a more explicit acknowledgement that we have to worry about our goals and how we would like the world to be. And that vision needs to be integrated with the tools and analysis that are appropriate to the vision and the implementation strategies that are also appropriate to the vision. So the vision of the world and our place in it, I think, is changing. We in the past lived in a relatively empty world. The economic subsystem, so first of all, recognizing that the economy is a subsystem of this larger finite global ecosystem, was relatively small. It couldn't impact in a significant way, except for locally and regionally, the functioning of that ecosystem, which provides life support, basically, for the subsystem. you obviously can't have the subsystem damaging the larger system within which it's contained without having some serious repercussions. What's changed from the empty world vision of the world? Well, first of all, we're filling up the world. This is a nighttime satellite image of the world that shows where the people are distributed and really where the energy consumption from those people is distributed. And you can see it covers the planet quite significantly. And this is a fairly recent development. If you took a picture from space 100 years ago or 200 years ago, you would get a very different picture than this. It would be much darker. So we've had significant impacts on the number of species on the planet. In fact, our impacts on species are being called the third great extinction event in the history of the planet. The human population has expanded exponentially, as you can see from that center graph, in a fairly short time. And we're beginning to have impacts on global material cycles, like the nitrogen cycle, shown in the upper right-hand graph there. A lot of this is caused either directly or indirectly by our consumption of fossil fuels, which has been growing exponentially since the mid-1800s. At the same time, we're beginning to learn more, dramatically more, about how the planet functions. This is the results of a global atmospheric circulation model, one of the latest ones from NCAR, that really gives you a good picture, I think, in one place, of how the global climate system works. I mean, we all know about weather, and you sit in one place and listen to the weather reports, but here's a picture of what you're seeing is in white the relative humidity on the planet, and in orange the precipitation. And this is a hourly simulation for over the course of a whole year. So you can see the basic patterns of the climate emerging from that, the intertropical convergence zone and all the precipitation that's going on there, the frontal movements in both the northern and the southern hemisphere, and how much faster the southern hemisphere moves, simply because there's not so much land in the way to block that movement. So the roaring 40s, as they're sometimes called, really roar down there. You'll even see in the simulation things like the Indian monsoon evolving. And you can see India, at least the northwestern part of it, is fairly dry right now in March. By about the end of April or May, that begins to sock in and you get the monsoons forming. You can see the effects of mountain ranges and other kinds of topographic features that determine how the climate works. So building this understanding of how the Earth system functions and also how the human population interacts with and impacts on that Earth system, I think is a key development. And is certainly relevant to this whole field of ecological economics. Let's see, now you can see the monsoon there in India, and I can watch this picture or this video for hours. Just let it rerun, and you really, it really impacts you, or you get the sense of just how complex the system really is. And some of the simulations have been done show exactly that relatively minor perturbations in the system could cause relatively major impacts. One of the possibilities that might occur due to global climate change is that the whole Gulf Stream system could shut off. If that were to happen, temperatures in northern Europe, or in Europe in general, would dramatically fall. So as a result of global warming, we'd have a real deep freeze going on in Europe, which would begin to have a climate more like Alaska, which is the latitude that it's at, if you look at this map. So I'll go on to the next one. This is from the latest IPCC report, which shows the temperature history of the Earth back 2,000 years. And this data with the yellow bars around it, the purple line with the yellow bars, is from ice core data. So you can go and take ice cores deep into Antarctica and look at the CO2 content in those particles that's captured in the ice and reconstruct this climate history way back. This part right here, you see the pointer? Yeah. Is the historical record since we started measuring temperatures around the world. And you can see there are ups and downs here. And if you just looked at this little part here, you might say, well, global climate change, global warming is not really happening. But if you look at the big picture, you can see that there is definitely an effect of the Anthropocene, as it's being called now. The time of human impact on the system. And then what you see beyond that are the projections of several different climate models, like the one I was showing you previously, all of which show significant increases in the global temperature in the next 100 years. So the bottom line from all of this is that we're having a significant effect on this global ecological life support system. If you try to quantify some of those impacts, this is data on the economic damages due to weather and flood catastrophes over the last 40 years by decade. And you can see that they're growing exponentially. So one of the effects of global climate change is increased storm frequency, increased storm intensity. That has severe economic implications. We're also getting a better picture of how the primary production on the planet works, how the biosphere part of the planet functions in relationship to that, to the climate system. This is a video of observational data of net primary production, both terrestrial and marine, over a 3-year period. You can see the greening up of the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere in alternate cycles. So we're getting a much better observational picture, too, of how the planet functions. So in terms of the vision, though, what's changed is that we now recognize that we live in a relatively full world, that the economic subsystem is large. It has major and can have even larger impacts on this finite global ecosystem. And so what we need to really be worrying about is just that interaction between the economic subsystem and the larger finite global ecosystem. Here's another, I'm not sure how well this one shows up. One way of looking at that is the what's called the ecological footprint. How big is the human presence relative to the ecological life support system? And you can look at the amount of resources that are required to maintain the human presence. And if you put those all into units of land area, then you see from this graph that we've surpassed the land area on the Earth back in about 1977 or so. And since then, we're living on stored reserves. We're living off the stock rather than the flow. And so this could be argued to be a non-sustainable situation. Once you're living off the money in the bank and not the interest, then that's not a sustainable income. So we're now up to, we need another quarter of an Earth or so if we wanted to sustain our current population. I don't know where we're going to get that extra quarter of an Earth, but that's what we would need. The other approach is to bring our consumption levels back within the sustainable levels of that the biosphere can provide. And that then sets the stage for what ecological economics is all about. Just to give you the etiology of the phrase, both ecology and economics have the same Greek root, oikos, which means house. So ecology is literally the study of the house, and economics is literally the management of the house. And ecological economics, therefore, is the management of the house, our Earth, as if we knew something about it. Which we do now, and so we need to integrate those two fields of knowledge, which haven't been well integrated in the past. It's focused on 3 integrated goals. First, to maintain an ecologically sustainable scale or size of the economic subsystem, so that that economic subsystem can continue indefinitely, so it can be sustainable. This whole issue of sustainability and sustainable development, I think, is a key one, as a key goal, and this gets back to the notion of our visions of the future. How would we like the world to be? Obviously, we would like the world to continue. We would like our presence as a species to continue on the planet. So we want the planet to be sustainable and us within it. We would also like to have a socially fair distribution of resources, both within the current generation of humans, but also between the current generation and future generations. That's kind of the Brundtland definition of sustainability. But I think beyond that, between humans and other species that we share the planet with. How do we have a fair distribution? What are our notions of fairness? And how do we implement those? And finally, that we want an economically efficient allocation of resources. We don't want to waste resources. But to do that, we need to incorporate in the allocation mechanism all of the resources that actually affect our welfare and affect our well-being. And it turns out that the market system doesn't cover many important classes of resources, including natural capital and social capital and other things that I'll mention. So there are a lot of things that are non-marketed contributions to our welfare, which are left out, and therefore this allocation mechanism is very imperfect and very inefficient. So you can argue, I think, that currently our system, our economic system, is not ecologically sustainable. It's not socially fair. It's not even economically efficient. How do we improve on that? How do we create this new system that's more to our liking, more the future that we would like to see? How do we do that? We build and maintain this transdisciplinary dialogue. There's no way that any one discipline is going to be able to attack these three integrated problems or goals. So we have to draw on all of the knowledge that we have about the world, not just some subset of that knowledge. And we have to build a way of talking about, a way of communicating, or a better way of communicating. So that's one of the experiments we're doing with this discussion in the class. How do we build a way of discussing these complex problems that can actually lead to a increased understanding of the system? We need to focus more on problems rather than tools. And that just means that many disciplines are too focused, I think, on the mechanisms, the problems, the tools and techniques that they have, that they've developed, and forget about what the real problems are. We need to develop a more integrated science, one that balances synthesis and analysis. We know very well how to take these problems apart into their fundamental pieces, but then how do we put them back together and look at how the whole system functions? So that synthesis part has been given too little weight in the past, and we need to have a better balance between those two elements of science. And we need to develop more effective and adaptive institutions. And as I said, subsequent speakers in the series will be going into more depth in all of these issues. Herman Daly will talk about the scale issue. Several people, I think, will talk about the distribution issue as well as the allocation issue, and several of the methods that have been developed for enhancing dialogue and getting larger public participation as well. Just to get into a little more detail about how the vision is changing, this is sort of the empty world model of the economy. You can see that it's kind of hanging out there in a vacuum. There's no context. There's no real natural environment that this or ecological system within which this economy functions. You see the major factors of production: manufactured capital, labor, and land. But land is kind of grayed out there just to indicate that there's an assumption of almost perfect substitutability between these factors. So if you run out of natural resources or land, you can always substitute more manufactured capital or labor and continue with the economic process measured here as GNP, producing goods and services. And then the only real decision to make is how much of this do we consume now, and how much do we reinvest in building more capital so that we can consume more in the future. How do we make the system grow as fast as possible, as it were? There's also the idea that individual utility and welfare is largely a function of the consumption of these goods and services. And that property rights are fairly simple, that there's either private property or publicly owned property. OK, so that's the empty world model. Here's more of the full world model, which recognizes that we live in a materially closed and finite Earth system. Everything has to go somewhere. That there's not perfect substitutability between the factors of production. And in fact, we've relabeled some of them to indicate better what they are. Instead of talking about land, we're talking about natural capital. So this is ecosystems and all of the services that they provide. We're talking about human capital instead of labor, just to indicate that it's not just the physical labor of people, but it's more and more it's the information and knowledge that they have. So you need to invest in education and training and research in order to build up this human capital component. There's the traditional manufactured capital, but then there's also social capital, which is all the institutions and networks and mechanisms that we have for communicating with each other and acting together as a society. So government is a form of social capital. Networks that you have over the internet are another form of social capital. All the kinds of interactions that you have with other people are a very important form of capital that's been ignored up until fairly recently. All of those forms of capital then interact to produce the traditional goods and services, but they also produce waste products as a byproduct. But they also produce more directly contributions to human well-being. And the psychology of well-being will be the topic of Richard Howarth's talk next Thursday. But this is much more complicated than simply the consumption of goods and services. That's only a part of it, and usually it only matters to humans' well-being up to a certain relatively low threshold. Once you have enough to eat, a place to sleep, etc., then other things start to become more important to people's happiness, their welfare, their real welfare in a broad sense. So if we're building an economy in the future that is concerned about both the sustainability and the desirability of that economy, we have to worry about what really contributes to human well-being, what creates a desirable system, and also the sustainability. What do the dynamics of the system look like? What are the things that could cause it to collapse or to reduce that level of well-being? Ecosystem services and amenities contribute directly to that well-being, as well as indirectly through their contribution to the economic process. And I think the management implications in this full world model are more focused on those two goals of sustainability and desirability, and not maximizing the growth rate of the system. Okay, how do we measure the well-being of that system, of that economic subsystem? In the past, we've focused more on measuring economic income. GNP is a good example. And on the nightly news, you'll often hear people talking about what's happening to GNP. But GNP is a very poor measure of welfare, and this has been known for quite a while. And the reasons are that it doesn't really measure welfare. All it measures is income, activity. It's how much, how fast is the wheel turning? How fast is the car going? And so you can get some very weird results if you start confusing that with welfare. And in fact, I think we are getting some of these weird results. If there's an oil spill, for example, GNP is going to go up because someone has to go and clean up the oil spill. There's more economic activity involved. That creates a larger GNP. Nothing ever gets subtracted from GNP. It only gets added. So all the disamenities that are attendant to this economic activity get counted as positives, just like the negative, the real positives. So there have been some attempts to look more at economic welfare, to subtract out the negative effects, and come up with, there was an early attempt called the Measure of Economic Welfare, and a more recent one called the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But even these measures still presume this connection between consumption and welfare. The more you consume, the better off you are. This at least looks at the net effect as opposed to the gross effect. But you can go beyond that and look at human welfare more directly and start to assess what are basic human needs and how well are those needs being met in a particular economic situation. So, and there are some people working along those lines to try to build measures of human needs assessment, human needs fulfillment, without necessarily assuming that more consumption actually achieves that goal. So in this context, the most efficient economy from the human welfare point of view would be the one that meets human needs most efficiently with the least amount of consumption of resources and goods and services, rather than simply assuming that more is better. Anyway, this does make a big difference, which of these goals and which of these measures you use to assess how well we're doing. The ISEW Just to summarize it, it's a little more complicated than this, but the basic categories have to do with starting with personal consumption, which is then weighted by income distribution, to acknowledge that if you're talking about welfare versus income, a dollar's worth of additional income to a rich person doesn't produce as much additional welfare as a dollar's worth of income to a poor person. So you have to bring in this income distribution effect, and that partially gets at the distribution goal, the fair distribution goal of ecological economics. You add non-defensive public expenditures, but subtract defensive public expenditures. So if we have to pay for additional health care costs because of air pollution, that's not a positive addition. That should be subtracted. It should be subtracted off. We add capital formation and the services from domestic labor. So all of the mothers who stay at home to take care of their kids are given no credit in the current GNP accounting. But that's a significant component, really, of the economic services that are going on. So you need to add that in. And these last two subtract the cost of environmental degradation and the depreciation of natural capital. When you do that for a few of the countries for which it's been done, you get results that look like this. So for the US, in the upper left-hand corner there, the dark line, the solid line in all these cases is the GDP index, and the dotted line is the ISEW index, with 1970 set at 100. And you can see that in a lot of cases, there's a good correlation between the early 50s and maybe the mid to late 70s. And after that, GNP continues to go up, but ISEW flattens out and heads down. This is indicating that we've passed a significant threshold where the additional costs of this economic activity, the things that have to be subtracted out of the ISEW, are now balancing out and in some cases outweighing the benefits of that activity. So we're not really increasing our economic welfare. And this is saying nothing about the human welfare kinds of measures, just the economic welfare kinds of measures. Our economic welfare is stagnant or going down, partly because we are focused on the wrong goals, we're using the wrong measures, we don't really have the appropriate vision of what the economy is in this larger context, and also what our goals are for this larger system. A major component of the resources that contribute to our welfare are the services provided by intact ecosystems. We did a survey several years ago that tried to look at, to enumerate all of these services and to look at what their relative contribution to our welfare was. Services can be distinguished from the functions of ecosystems in that services are the contributions to welfare of ecosystem functions. They range over fairly global level kinds of services, maintaining the climate and the composition of the atmosphere, to more regional things like regulating disturbances, supplying water, regulating that water supply, controlling erosion and sediments, forming soils, cycling nutrients, treating wastes, pollination, biological control, for providing refugia for populations. So all of those that I've mentioned so far are really not ones that most people would say are direct contributions to their welfare. They're sort of one step back, but they're nonetheless real and nonetheless very important. More direct contributions would be things like food and raw materials, genetic resources, recreation, and cultural amenities. So there's a broad range here, both in terms of the directness of their connection, the physical scale of their provision, but we tried to look at all of those services. We got into the whole issue of valuation. How do you compare those ecosystem services with the other goods and services that the economy is providing? And you get into this whole issue of valuation. This slide just makes the point that the value of something really relates to its contribution to meeting a particular goal. And so there's a basis, there's a goal basis for the value. And then valuation would be the process of estimating to what extent a particular thing contributes to meeting a particular goal. As I said at the beginning, ecological economics has these three main goals: sustainability, fairness, and efficiency. The conventional economic model of valuation is only looking at the efficiency goal. And to satisfy that, you only look at individual humans isolated from their brethren. You look at current individual preferences. The future is not really given very much weight usually. You don't really need to discuss among yourselves that valuation exercise, and there's not really much scientific input beyond what people already know about the system. And you look at, you can assess people's willingness to pay for various alternatives as a way to assess their efficiency-based value. But there are these whole areas that really haven't gotten much work yet, but I think are wide open research areas. What is the fairness-based value of particular resources and the sustainability-based value? You would have to look, for fairness, you would have to look at whole communities, whole groups. They would have to have a lot of discussion to come up with what the contribution would be. And there would at least be a moderate level of scientific input to that discussion. And you might think of methods like John Rawls' idea of the veil of ignorance. If people have to vote from behind a veil of ignorance about where they stood in society, they would vote in a fairer way. Sustainability is going to require that you look at the whole system, including humans and other species and the rest of the planet, the whole biosphere. It requires a medium level of discussion at least and a high level of scientific input, and would probably require some sort of modeling approach, but with a precautionary bent to it. And so I'll talk about all of those things in a little bit more detail in this talk as well. Our initial synthesis was published in Nature in 1997. We managed to put together several hundred studies that had looked at various of those ecosystem services for various of these biomes that are listed here, and added those up and came up with a value per hectare per year. And these, the largest section in this paper actually was the section on limitations and caveats and problems with the method. But if you go through that list, almost all of the, if not all of the problems that we identified, if they were solved, would actually lead to larger values than we see here. For example, one problem was, well, there's incomplete coverage of all of the services for all of the biomes, and some biomes didn't have any studies associated with them, so they're just blanks here. If you start to fill in those blanks, or you start to fill out the studies to cover more of the services for more of the biomes, you would get even larger numbers. If you start to look at the dynamic interconnections, this is a static snapshot that says, right now, to the best of our ability, what is the value of these systems? This is what you would get. You add those all up, multiply the per hectare values by the area of each biome, and add those all up, and you get a value that's on the order of $33 trillion a year, which is larger than the conventional GNP of the planet. So, and again, that's a very conservative estimate. So the bottom line here is that ecosystems are providing a huge chunk of contribution to our welfare that's not picked up in the conventional market estimates of income and welfare. And therefore, we need to do a much better job of understanding those services and bringing them into the allocation mechanism if we hope to achieve this efficiency goal. Here's some other ways of looking at that. This is actually a map of the marketed economic activity, which is based on that nighttime satellite image that I showed you earlier, which it turns out correlates quite well with GNP, but allows you to make the economic activity more spatially explicit. So normal figures are limited to a country level of resolution. Here you can go down to a square kilometer level of resolution and say, where is the conventional sort of economic activity going on? You can then compare that with the ecosystem services based activity. And you can see that that's happening much more in the tropics and elsewhere on the planet than the conventional economic activity, which are shown as white spots here. Then you can add those two together and you get at least a subtotal, the natural and the sort of built capital components of economic activity, leaving out the social capital and the human capital, but a much a better subtotal than we have from just looking at one or the other. And you can see how that's distributed. I hope you can see how that's distributed around the planet. And then you can aggregate that in any way you want spatially. One convenient way is back to the country level. And here you can look at the ecosystem services produced in each country. And obviously, the bigger the country is, the larger that number is going to be, all else being equal. You can look at the subtotal and how that's of both the ecosystem services and the conventional economic activity and how that's distributed. You can look at the subtotal per capita as well, which shows probably a better measure, or at least a better approximation to the real wealth and welfare contribution per person in these countries. And you can see that places with not very many people, like Australia, but quite good ecosystem services and quite good economies, are very high there. What's surprising is that Western Europe, the U.S., many places that we think of as being in the first world, in this way of looking at things, would really be in maybe the second world. I don't know about the third world, but they're not in the first tier of countries in terms of that total contribution to welfare. As I said, this leaves out the social capital component. And there has been some progress recently looking at how do we estimate social capital. Robert Putnam, in particular, has done some interesting work on that. And here's a map of his social capital index across the United States. And you can see that there's one particular place up here in the Northeast that, for some reason, sticks out as having a lot of social capital, and that really does contribute, it turns out, to the welfare of the people that live up here in many different ways. And there are some other states down here that, and particularly this one, for some reason, that seems to be quite low in social capital. How does that social capital contribute to human welfare? What do you need to do to build social capital? All of those questions, I think, are really interesting ones, and will be covered in more detail by some of the subsequent speakers in the series as well. We've done some work in Baltimore. Matt Wilson in our group and Morgan Grove here at the Forest Service and Amanda Walker, one of our graduate students, in Baltimore. And as I'll get to in a little bit, Baltimore is a long-term ecological research site for us and several other investigators. One of the first LTER sites that's an urban site where we look at the city as an ecosystem as well. And we surveyed people in Baltimore with this list of questions. The ones that are starred then go into this social capital index. And that ends up looking like this at a smaller scale than the national scale that was shown earlier. You can do this by census block, and this really gives you a neighborhood social capital index. So how much do people feel like their neighborhood is providing, and the people that live in their neighborhood providing social capital to them. And you can see there's really not a good pattern in this, and certainly not the conventional kinds of patterns you would see in urban areas. So there are things that affect social capital that we're not taking into account. It certainly doesn't correlate well with median income or many other things. Okay, what's the next step in all of this? How do we build this shared understanding of these integrated systems? Well, we have to build models of some kind. Models I take to mean very generally abstract representations of these systems that we can then manipulate and use to help understand the way the system works. I think these ecological economic models need to have several characteristics that are distinct from the way we've used models in the past. They need to be more integrated. They need to look across all of these disciplines. But they can also be used as a consensus building tool in this more open and participatory process. How do we get people involved from the very beginning in the modeling process, not just as users of the final model, but as participants in constructing this abstract representation, constructing what goes into it, helping to design how it's manipulated and what sort of questions it is used to answer. And if you do that, you find that they're much more amenable to using the results of the model when it finally comes out. These models also need to be at multiple scales. Any one scale of observation is going to give you limited answers. And so we need to look at these problems from multiple scales in space and time simultaneously, or at least sequentially. It has to acknowledge uncertainty and limited predictability. So the idea that these are complex adaptive systems that we're talking about. There are limits to their predictability. We cannot know exactly what's going to happen. Our models can help us to uncover that uncertainty rather than to disguise it. And you have to acknowledge the values that all of the stakeholders in this participatory process bring to the problem, that multiple modeling approaches will be necessary. There's no one right way to model any of these complex systems. And we have to look at multiple approaches and compare them, intercalibrate them. And we have to acknowledge that these complex systems are evolutionary in nature. Their degree of optimization is limited. They have a history. They have a path that they've gone through. And that humans and the rest of nature are co-evolving in these systems. They're not necessarily reacting only to one or the other. OK, we've done some work in this modeling area, which I don't have time to go into detail on. And I will just skip over and point you to some websites where you can get more detail. In general, we end up doing spatially explicit models that look at what's going on at each point in space and then how that all works in an interconnected way. We've done some work in the Everglades, which looks at a very important ecosystem and ecological economic management problem. And there's a website you can go to for that. That has some quite elaborate results. We've more recently been working in the Patuxent watershed in Maryland and the Gwynns Falls watershed in Baltimore as part of that LTER study that I mentioned. And there's a website you can go and look at the results of that project and how that's worked in terms of integrating stakeholders, building these fairly sophisticated models at the watershed scale, sort of the complements or the analogs of what's being done at the global scale that I showed you earlier. We can use those models to look at a whole range of different scenarios, both historical scenarios, what the system looked like in the past and how it behaved in the past, which we obviously can't observe directly, and current situations and future scenarios, including things that can do real experiments that you couldn't otherwise do with the system. For example, you might ask the question, what's the effect of agriculture in our system? Well, you can take the model and take all the agriculture out and replace it with forests and see how it would then behave and what's the difference. So we can do all of those kinds of things, and there's a reference here, but also the website. We also then can use this idea of ecosystem services and the total system value to look at those different scenarios and see which ones are really producing an increase in the value of the landscape versus only increasing one component of that at the expense of others. We can do this at multiple scales, as I said, and we're working at the global scale on a model we call Gumbo that tries to integrate what's known about the functioning of the natural capital components, the atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, biosphere, and the anthroposphere, the human capital components, using ecosystem services and human impacts as the links between those two. When are we supposed to end exactly? Like, yeah, so we're over at 1:30 or 1:45? Okay. This global model has several characteristics, which I won't go into a lot of detail, but it's really the first integrated global model that I know of that focuses on this issue of ecosystem services and all four of these capital types that we've mentioned and how they're interconnected, how their dynamics work over time. It also looks at alternative scenarios into the future. And we based the scenarios in that model on another study that was looking at alternative visions of the future, getting back to this idea of how would we like the world to be. And this taxonomy looked at two basic worldviews, the technological optimist and the technological skeptic, compared with what the real state of the world is, which we really don't know. But if you array those two worldviews against these two states of the world, then you get four different future scenarios, which correspond actually pretty well with the IPCC scenarios that they've been using, but calling different things. The bottom line in this was if we want a policy that actually assures sustainability, the one future that we want to stay out of is the Mad Max future. All of the other futures are really sustainable. The Star Trek future says, well, in reality, these resources, these factors of production are substitutable. We can go out and explore other planets. If we run out of planets, we'll get more, etc. So that's a sustainable future if those assumptions really are correct. Certainly, the Ecotopia future is what we conventionally think of as the sustainable future, and the big government future is also sustainable. So we really want to stay out of this box. And the best way to stay out of that box is to assume this worldview and assume this set of policies, at least until we can be sure of what set of these assumptions are correct. Anyway, we used that. We also did some surveying of people and asked them how comfortable they would be living in each of these worlds. And you can see that Mad Max was really not only not sustainable, but not desirable by most people, whereas the other three were to varying degrees desirable, but the Ecotopia future was actually the most desirable one. How do we develop policies that, how do we flesh out that vision of the future, present that to the public as an alternative to the Star Trek vision of the future, which they're not getting very many alternatives to where we seem to be headed, and then try to decide how to get there. We use those scenarios in the Scumbo model. We have results from that model for a whole range of different variables and parameters, some of which we have historical data to calibrate the model to. So this goes from 1900 to 2000, and then from 2000 out to 2100. I won't go into details on how this model works, but if you're interested, you can download the paper, I think, from our website. And also you can download the model and run it on your PC and play with it. And that was one of our goals in this, too, was to make the model more usable by people. It does a fairly good job of reproducing the physical and economic data that we have over the last 100 years, and then projects a series of scenarios which have quite a range of behavior, depending, again, on what your internal assumptions are and what sort of policies you implement in terms of investing in these different forms of capital. Okay, it also allows us to look at the value of ecosystem services over time and according to different scenarios. And this lower right-hand graph gives our overall estimate of the value of those services by scenario. We can compare that with the GWP, and actually doing it this way, incorporating the interactions between the parts of the system, doing a more dynamic picture, gives us a value that's about 4.5 times GWP for the ecosystem services. And we can combine both the consumption-based and the non-consumption-based contributions to welfare and get an overall global welfare indicator that we can then compare by scenario as well. So it's a way to integrate all of these ideas that I've been talking about and look at them in a more dynamic framework. Certainly not perfect, but this is a way for building this shared understanding and shared discussion of this complex system, at least one way. And we've also been doing more work on taking that Ecotopia vision and fleshing it out. We've had some workshops with groups of about 40 people that ask, how do you envision, or what would you like the world to look like in the year 2100? And they have sets of characteristics. You can go to this website and look at the details there in terms of what the natural, built, human, and social capital structure of our world should look like under this more desirable state. Okay, thanks very much. And we have time for questions. Now what we're going to do is, you guys are going to.
Start questions. I'll collect cards.
If you haven't already collected them, have you collected them?
No, pass your card down the row.
Yep. Go ahead. You could. You could just say where it's coming from, and that's going to be balanced with. The reading didn't cover everything that I talked about.
So the first couple of questions are going to be based on the discussion messages that were posted that were based on the readings that were posted online. And then we're going to try to integrate some of the questions from the audience into that. So the first question was just that you mentioned that the best way to be successful in ecological economics is by having an overall goal for the world, which was talking about your Mad Max, Star Trek model. And our world, however, contains many differences in opinion about government, politics, religion, and general views on life. This reader was curious how it will be decided which of the 4 alternative future histories of the Earth will be picked for the world, and whether it will be possible for the entire globe to work together towards that goal.
Okay, that's a very good question, and I think that gets at the whole issue of governance and what governance is about or should be about. And Amartya Sen has said that democracy is really should really be based on a broad-based discussion about values and futures. And I think that's not the case currently with our even our most advanced democracies. And so this issue, I think, should be a central one to our whole governance system. What sort of future would we like? We've tended to ignore that question and just say, well, let everybody choose their own alternative future, and the conventional mechanisms of the market and other social mechanisms will get us there. But in fact, in this full world context, as opposed to in the empty world context, that might have been appropriate because there weren't that many people. You didn't get in each other's way. Your interactions with both other people and with the underlying life support system were not as intense. So what's really changed is we're now in the full world. In the full world, we have to talk to each other. We have to have an ongoing discussion. And we have to come to some sort of consensus about our desired future. This little matrix just said that there are fundamental uncertainties about the future as well, and about the nature of the world. And we have to take those fundamental uncertainties into account. And so if one of our goals by consensus as a society is sustainability, then we would prefer, or we should prefer, more precautionary, more skeptical kinds of policies about technology's ability to solve problems, at least until we can get closer to resolving that uncertainty. So I hope that answers the question.
The next question is, how has the gumbo model been received by the World Economic Forum and/or UNESCO? In other words, how do we get this model to be discussed at a global level?
I'm open to suggestions on that. One thing we are doing is the IGBP, the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, which is a large international body of scientists, has ongoing programs to study global change. One of the subdivisions is called GAME, the Global Analysis and Integrated Modeling component. And we're getting gumbo into that subcomponent of this scientific process. So getting it to be accepted by the scientific community. Otherwise, writing papers, publishing books, word of mouth from from you guys, I guess, would be the mechanisms that we're working on. But also getting broader participation in that process of building that model. So by making it accessible, people can take it, look at it, modify it, give us some feedback, and hopefully we can make it a broad community model, a way of furthering this discussion of these issues rather than just providing an answer.
Wow, as you mentioned, it's on our website and you can share with us, so you can download it.
Right. Everybody hear that? You can go to our website, which I mentioned at the beginning, and you can download the model itself and play around with it if you want to. And you can also download a paper describing the model and take a look at that. There's the website.
So this one's going back to the article. Your article stated that the majority of people surveyed would rather live in a utopia. Although there are clearly no easy answers, it seems that one huge step in the change would be to move away from the conventional model of the economy and to the expanded model of the ecological economic system. How would this change from the efficiency value to the sustainable value that you mentioned be brought? Do you recommend government aid and incentive? Do you recommend more education in schools? And most importantly, what can we, as students at UVM and responsible citizens of the planet, do today and in the future to help facilitate these changes?
Again, I'm open to suggestions. And the two that you mentioned, I think, are certainly good ones. And I don't think there's any silver bullet here. There's no one thing that we need to do. I think there's many things that we need to do. Among those is just bringing this discussion to a much wider audience. So this is not a discussion for purely academic economists or academic ecologists. I think it's a discussion that needs to happen, in the population at large. How to make that occur? I'm certainly open to suggestions. And if anybody has one right now, go ahead and send it in. But as students at UVM, I think you're in an enviable position because this university and our institute, I think, are definitely trying to push this ball forward, to expand the envelope. And hopefully, and we're all part of that process. So I think this could be the place from which this wave of change emanates.
How do people who struggle to meet basic needs participate in an economic system in which air and water are valued? How is this not hocus pocus to them?
If I understand that question, air and water are important to everybody, whether or not they have a dollar income or not. In fact, that's part of the problem with poverty in many countries, is that we substitute, we drive people off the land where their money income is low, but their level of welfare and their level of sustainability may have been relatively high, and into cities where their income might be slightly higher, their dollar income, but their real welfare has decreased significantly. I think the problem is not paying attention to what we really mean by human welfare, to include not only the consumption of goods and services, but also these other elements. And if we did pay attention to that, and if we also paid attention more to the distributional aspects of that welfare and the social capital aspects, I think we'd have a very different structure to our economic system at all different scales. And that poverty would not be the problem that it is. We have enough resources to go around now. They're just distributed very poorly. So, how do we make that transition? And I think the first step is recognizing what actually contributes to people's welfare. The people that overconsume don't really need to do that in order to have a high quality of life. In fact, the psychological evidence is that their quality of life is less because of their overconsumption rather than more. So, bringing that fact that's very interesting, and I think Rich Howarth in his next talk will talk a lot about this, that the real basis for feelings of well-being has to do more with relative consumption rather than absolute consumption, and it doesn't really correlate with consumption beyond a certain point. So, if we in the sort of overdeveloped countries could get off of this rat race, as it were, then a lot more of those resources would be available to providing the basic needs for people who still don't have it.
You suggested that, this is also from the reading, you suggested that when as a society we make decisions based solely on economic efficiency, we lack democratic debate on the values of fairness and sustainability. In our society, powerful special interest groups largely regulate social decision-making. Industries that take advantage of people and abuse the environment by alliances with government officials and airtime in the media. This person agrees that community-level dialogue is essential to democratic change. There's a serious difference in the income of, say, for example, the Trekkies and the Ecotopians. And will the lower income group be able to overcome the influence of the upper income group in the government? And how can society free itself from the grip of profit-driven special interest groups? How can we prevent lobbyists and skewed advertising from thwarting the process of developing a shared vision?
John, you want to answer this question? again, that's a very good question, and I think that is a key issue. How do we actually return America and other countries to democracy? I don't think we have a real democracy in these countries right now, if you define that as government by the people, for the people. We have government by moneyed interests, for moneyed interests, and that's something that has to be changed. So that's a serious limitation, I think, in terms of achieving a sustainable and desirable future. How to change that, I think, is really also the democratic process. That we have to overcome some of these fairly large hurdles that look like they're getting even larger.
To what degree is your work in ecological economics being integrated into mainstream economics? To what degree is your model of the economic system shaping public policy?
Okay, we can defer that one for John's talk at the end of the of the session. And it's interesting that this is one question that I almost always get asked after giving this talk, and I'm probably exactly the wrong person to answer it, because I would hope that it's having probably more influence than it is, but at the same time, I'm really not, sort of aware of all of what's going on in that regard. I think in many of these kinds of processes, looking back historically, when there's a major paradigm shift, a change in the vision and of how the world works, often it comes in three stages. And the first stage is when it's basically ignored. That's not really an issue. The second stage is when it's acknowledged that there's some alternative there, but it's seen to be obviously false. And then the third stage is when when everybody says, "Oh yes, of course, we knew that all along." So I'm not sure where we are in that process, but I think it's somewhere between stage 2 and hopefully stage 3. Because I certainly get both ends of that spectrum. Okay, other questions?
Do you think the government will ever encourage U.S. citizens to reduce consumption in order to give sustainability a better chance?
What can I say? I hope so. But I don't think it's the government that needs to do it. I think it's us that needs to force the government to do it, or us as a society that needs to do it. I don't think, if left to the government, I don't think it will ever happen. So it's getting these ideas into a broader discussion, and then using that leverage to change who we elect and what the government does. So I'm still hopeful that will happen, but it's hard to be optimistic at the moment.
How do you define social capital? How have the criteria developed? And do they reflect cultural biases? For example, North versus South?
Well, social capital is usually defined as the degree of interconnection and participation among multiple individuals. So what's the extent and the strength of the networks among individuals of various kinds? Operationally, that often gets measured as things like participation in social organizations, participation in government activities, participation in government overall, sort of rates of voting and things like that. So there's a difference between how it's defined and how it's operationally measured, which is not perfect. But probably the best thing to read there would be Robert Putnam's book called Bowling Alone, which is a discussion of social capital, how it's measured, and what it is.
what happens to a species or process for which no values to humans can be found? I.e., is there a danger of basing protection of the ecosystem on human-defined values as opposed to inherent values?
I guess you could say that let's see how to phrase this. That's not an excuse for not looking at the functional values of ecosystem services. So you can have multiple approaches to this problem, and assuming that there are intrinsic values to systems or other values that haven't been incorporated yet, etc. I think that's all acknowledged as we go. That we're looking at is still very much of an imprecise and a fairly conservative estimate of what the true value of these systems are. But that's not an argument for not making the attempt, to incorporate more of these values, because that still brings to the fore the fact that there are a lot of things we haven't thought of, that we haven't looked at. And as you start bringing more and more of these issues to bear, you recognize that the life support system taken as a whole is just more and more important to what we do. So often that's kind of taken as an argument for trying to estimate the contributory or the functional values of ecosystems. But I don't think it's a good argument for that. I think it's a good argument to say that we're never going to pick up everything, and there will always be a larger value than what we anticipated or what we were able to measure. Last question, and then the rest we'll try and answer on the web. So if you want to go to the website after that. Oh, good. Finally.
Will it be possible to make the needed changes in our current lifestyles and actions before it is too late?
It sounds a lot like the other question.
Will we leave ourselves with enough resources to be successful when we embrace a different worldview? Would a catastrophic event be needed to help facilitate the shift from the public opinion to public judgment?
Okay, I'll answer the last of those questions. Because looking back historically, often catastrophic events are kind of necessary to trigger some basic shift in worldview and ways of thinking about these problems. And one can always hope that won't be necessary. But often there is some sort of trigger event, something that happens that just forces people to look at the situation in a different way. I think even biological evolution tends to work that way, in a more discontinuous and punctuated sort of way, and not quite so gradual as we might hope. But I think the challenge for us is to create an alternative vision of the future, one that's broadly more desirable, broadly more sustainable, to fill in the details, to flesh out that vision and say, here's a world that we could achieve, and to be sort of ready when that event happens, when there is some target, when there's some opportunity for people to learn and to discuss these kinds of issues. So I think that's what we're trying to do with ecological economics, is to create the alternative visions of the future, to look at the evolving vision of how the world works, how we would like it to be, to try and provide as much analysis and the appropriate kind of analysis to back that up, and also to talk about various kinds of implementation strategies that we would use. Janet Milne is going to talk about ecological tax reform as one sort of way to help us get towards where we're going. And I think several of the other speakers in the series, as I said, will flesh out many of these ideas. So hopefully we've begun an interesting and productive journey with this seminar series, with this series of courses that we can begin to build this shared understanding of the world, and begin to build this alternative vision of the future that is the only way of ever achieving the vision, really, is to paint the picture first and then get people to think about it and to come along. So with that, we'll end, and thanks very much, and hopefully we'll see you next Thursday.